Hi, welcome back to Java, not Java, I shouldn't say Java, CS170. We're going to go into JavaScript. Um, I'm trying to think how's the best way to break this up. So I think we're going to probably just introduce some basic concepts, namely variables. And there's a couple of different ways we can go with the variables. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this first lecture here. I'm just going to kind of step through it. I'm going to give you a reference. And feel free to send me an email if there's a particular aspect about variables, then I can make like another short video clip to follow up on it. Okay, so this video clip is going to cover JavaScript introduction and variables. Okay, and let's see how far we can go with this. So you already know for your HTML, you remember this, right? So you have the head, and really when you want to do JavaScript, you have to have this, right? Where it says script, and then you close off the script and you put your JavaScript in there. You can do it at the head level or the body level, right? And there's probably some guidelines on what you should put here and what you can put down here. But I'm not going to go into that for this part of the lecture. We'll do it when we go into some more example code, right? Just know that when you do the JavaScript, it's going to be between these two bits here. You can't just put the JavaScript into your HTML. Okay, so that's the main thing you want to know from this. Don't worry too much more about it. We're going to do more examples, okay? So we have the basic syntax, all right? So a couple of things that you would note. Case sensitive is kind of important, right? So a lot of times in the past, we've seen people writing programs and they can't figure out what's going on and why it looks like something should be working when it's not. It's a lot of times because of this case sensitive aspect, right? So people type some stuff, it looks like it should be the same, but because it's case sensitive, it's not quite exactly the same, okay? Note this with the semicolon, right? So you do one statement, then you have the semicolon to finish it off, and that's just more for the browser to understand, what the statement is. Okay. Now this idea of syntax versus convention, I'll kind of go more into that a little bit later, right? But just think about it as syntax would be something where the program actually doesn't work, right? Because you didn't follow a certain rule, right? So that's kind of like syntax, that's hard and fast. Whereas a convention doesn't necessarily break things, but it's just kind of like an agreement between everyone who's working on it. Like that would be the convention on something, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Okay. So I think the main thing really with this lecture is the idea of variables, right? So you think for people who may not know, in a program, a variable, you can think of a variable as like a storage area, right? So you remember we were doing calculations in the flow chart, stuff like that. So calculate the average, calculate like 1 plus 1 or 1 plus 2 or whatever. And people give us some information and we have to kind of store that somewhere. You kind of magically handle the storage of those things in your head, but for a computer program you can't do that. A computer program has to reference a container that holds values, and that's why you see like these little containers here, right? So as it says here, a variable is a memory location, right, that holds a value. So like it's a container that holds a value. And remember when we're looking at computer operations where you had to go to secondary storage or you had to go to memory to get your ingredients, right? So all the stuff that we had at the kitchen table, and you had to get the ingredients and then you were going to do stuff with it. Those things are all stored in a bucket or a container. And you can look at a variable as sort of like a name for that container, right? You probably don't want to say, oh, memory location, whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or something like that. For a human person, a computer actually would look at the memory location in that way. They don't actually care about the fact that you named a variable a nice friendly name that you can understand. But you can say this is a level of abstraction again, right? Instead of referring to a memory location by some byte or address, you actually are giving a name so that a human person can look at it and say, oh yeah, this is, you know, a variable XYZ, whatever, right? And it holds a value. Then once you have a container that a computer program can refer to, then you can do all kinds of stuff with it. You can do calculations with it, you can do manipulations with it and stuff like that. Okay, so that's how I like to think about variables. And so this kind of talks a little bit about it. Okay, now where it says syntax here, uh, you know, I'll highlight this is one of those areas that you will get tested on for the exam. And it's kind of important. If you're going to really seriously be doing stuff with JavaScript, uh, it is kind of important to know like what are the parameters you have to work with when you define a variable. Okay, so one of the key ones here, define a variable, you have to begin with a letter. Okay, and then you have a sequence of letters or numbers. You can have an underscore or a dollar sign. Okay, you can't have spaces. Um, you know, you might be used to it in your file system. You could just name whatever. It's almost like a little sentence or something, right? But for JavaScript, when you name a variable, it's not a good idea to put a space in there. It's just going to screw things up. The browser looking at the JavaScript is going to have no idea what that is. So it has to be all together, no spaces. Okay, and remember, like I said before, it's case sensitive. So you begin with the letter. You know, should it be uppercase? Should it be lowercase? Right? Now, there's nothing to prevent you from making it uppercase. Okay, but you see down here where it says convention, right? Again, and also be descriptive, right? But the first part, the first letter is lowercase. Um, it's not going to break the compiler. I mean, it's not going to break anything if you put an uppercase letter, right? And same thing with being descriptive. Back in the old days, it was very common for people to just call a variable like X or Y or Z, right? Or they just come up with some goofball name for it, right? And at the time, you know, I guess when they're programming, it works fine. The programmer who's working on it knows what those variables are, right? They come up with some goofball variable name. The problem is when someone else comes along and looks at that code, they have no idea what that is, right? So they look at X, Y, Z, and they're trying to say, okay, what does that mean? What's supposed to go into X? What's supposed to go into Y? But if you describe it in a nice way, it's almost like documenting your code by giving it good variable names, okay? So that's why you have these conventions here, right? As we get better and better with these things, we realize that it's not just about the person who wrote the code, but it's about other people who have to look at this code, maybe help them debug it. It helps you to, you know, debug the code better, support the code later when someone else looks at this code, not just the person who originally wrote the code. So that's why you have these idea of conventions for naming variables, okay? So this is the idea of camel case. You see this? It starts with a tax, and then when it changes to a different word, it makes it uppercase. So let's say I was doing something with amount here, right? Let's say United States, something like that, right? The truth is I probably wouldn't name it something like that, but the idea here, like I said, is you have the one word, and remember our convention here, this is not uppercase, right? But then you have a new word, so that's A, and that's U, right? So we change words here, right? Then we change words here, that's uppercase. So that's why, and this is cut off here. Let me move this over, okay? So that's what is called camel case, right? So that's just a convention. There's nothing from a compiler standpoint that's going to force you to do this. But it's nice for readability, right? You can imagine if I made all of this like lowercase, then it just looks like kind of like gobbledygook variable, right? So by having like this capital A, capital U, and S, it kind of makes it look like there's a few words that you can recognize there, so it's easier to read. Okay, so that's the idea of a camel case. Right, so like what I was saying before, syntax and convention. Right, so here's the breakdown here. Okay, this will break if you use something away from this. This will not break, but it's good practice. Okay, hopefully that's clear for everyone. Okay, so this is something just for your own practice. You can take a look at this and figure out whether you think this is legal or illegal. Okay, so you can see here legal. That looks fine, right? You know, day of week, right? All like alpha, alphanumeric, right? No problems there. Okay. Now you see illegal here. Why is that? Well, it's because you started off with a 3 here. Okay. So this is good. We have a number in here, but it's not the first character, so that's good. Okay. So this one, remember those 2 symbols that we said we can put in here, right? It's going to be either this underscore or the $sign. So this pound sign or hash is not good. Okay. So this is good. Underscore, right? Everything else is alphanumeric, no problem. And then remember this, the space, right? The space will kill you, so don't put a space in here, and that's illegal. Okay. So you guys think about that. If there's any questions on that, let me know. Okay. So now this goes back to another practice. Like think about meaningful names for this, right? If I just call this E or F, it doesn't mean anything. No one knows what the heck that is, right? But let's take a look at this, right? So E being the height of this rectangle, that makes sense, right? So if I call the variable height instead of E, that's good. And same over here with the F, that's width, right? So why don't I call the variable width, right? And then the output, I should call the output, I could store it into a variable called area. Okay, so this is really what they're talking about when they say make the variables a good descriptive name. Okay, now this is even like more refined. Okay, so now when you're looking at this, say, oh, well, this is a blue rectangle, so you can call it like the blue height, right? And then the blue width and the blue area. So it's good practice. I don't know, like in practice, are people, I don't know, should I say people are lazy or whatever? Will they actually do that? Most of the time, they're just going to call it height, width, and area. But yeah, technically, it's pretty good description to say, yeah, I have multiple rectangles, different colors, and so I'm talking about the variable for the blue height, right, and the blue width, and the blue area, right? I've seen some people get lazy and maybe they'll just say like height B and width B or something like that. But yeah, if you want to say this is the most descriptive, this would be it. Blue height, blue width, and blue area. Okay? All right. So how do you define a variable? How do you make it known that you have a variable for the computer to understand? How do you define that? And that's what var does, var. Okay. Uh, so a little container called age, right? So age. I want an area, so I define area, radius, so on and so forth. Nice convenience here is you can declare multiple variables in one shot, right? So instead of listing out var, 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 var all the way down, you can do var like this and then list your variables separated by commas, right? And note earlier I was saying between every statement, at the end of every statement, you have to have a semicolon. So see the semicolon here, right? So you need to put that in there. So most times when you know all the variables you want to use in the program, or at least a lot of the programs you want to use. I mean, the thing is in Java, in JavaScript, you can declare your variables anywhere you want. But again, that gets like a little bit messy. It's hard to follow. And sometimes it's easy to make a mistake and not know what the heck happened, right? Because you have an undeclared variable or something like that. So this is good. Usually you're going to see something like this. You'll see like a var up at the top, and then you'll see like these variables. Later on, we're going to get into things like variable scoping and stuff like that. But for now, let's just say, good idea. Do var and then name your variables up at the top. Then you have no values are assigned. So really, ideally, you declare the variable and define it with the value at the same time, right? So age, you can set it to 0, I guess, right? So var age equals to 0. Area, that's another number, so you can set that to 0. Radius, that's another number, you can set that to 0. Okay, but if you don't do anything, then this point is true. No values have been assigned, and that can trip you up sometimes too. So I just suggest you initialize the variables if you can. So there's this idea of data types. Right? If you haven't seen data types before, it's just to say what type of variable it is, right? So the data in there could be numbers, it could be strings, like a word, right? Would be a string. A Boolean means true or false. Okay. I'm going to stop here. I don't want to go too much more. I'm going to create another video for the rest of the stuff here. But hopefully this gives you a good introduction of what variables is. And if you really want to kind of see a bit more, maybe practice a little bit on what I just covered, on the w3schools.com, you see up here, jsvariables.asp. See this up here? You can go there. It's easy enough to search it too. You can do a search for JavaScript variables, like right here. Okay, JavaScript variables, and that'll bring you to w3schools.com, JavaScript variables, right? So here, look, see var, right? And then you see the X or Y or Z, right? Bad variable names, but those are legit variable names. And they initialize them, right? So equals to 5, equals to 6. And then they set up another variable equals to X plus Y. Okay? So try that on your own. I remember up at the top where I had the script there, you can do that. But don't worry about it if you can't do that. I'm going to be creating more video clips in a little bit. Okay, but I would suggest take a look at my video clip, follow along on this page. This page actually covers like a lot of different thoughts about variables, right? Data types, okay, declaration and initializing the variables, assigning values into the variables. Okay, and remember before I was saying you can have one line, var, and then the variable, now you initialize it, create another variable, initialize it, create another variable, initialize it, and the semicolon. Okay, so it's pretty much elaborates and drills more into what I just highlighted here. So go ahead and take a look at this. All right, so take whatever time you need, come back to me, let me know if there's any things that are tripping you up on variables, and I'll create another clip to follow on this. Otherwise, I'm going to start working on manipulation, assigning values into the variables in my next video clip. Okay, talk to you soon.